Hello, welcome to the stream. I hope everyone is doing well today. And today's stream is going to be about the Council of Trullo, also known as the Quinisext Council. Let me know if you guys hear me well, if the mic is good. It's also known as the Quinisext Council, and then I'll talk about how it relates to the East-West divide. I'd like to do more historically oriented streams related to church history. Uh, as I am a bit of a history buff, I do love history and I enjoy discussing history overall. All right. What's going on, Blaze? Good to see you. So let me share my screen here. We'll do this right here. All right. As I mentioned, today we're going to talk about the Council of Trullo and the East-West divide. How this council now this council isn't talked much about at all, actually, even though it is ecumenical. But there's a reason why this council isn't mentioned separately in talks. Now, this council is extremely, extremely important and pivotal in Orthodox Church history. So I want to address two main questions today in this stream, and then we'll tackle some other questions that kind of veer off this question. But what is the Council of Trullo, and why is it important to Orthodox Christians? And I guess the third sort of underlying theme here is going to be the divide between East and West, and how this council was this early sort of proponent of this, and it was kind of an early thing that even started before this council, but this council was one of the big reasons that sort of further perpetuated the East versus West divide. So I guess the underlying theme is going to be that East-West divide. But the two main questions are going to be, what is the Council of Trullo? Why is it important to Orthodox Christians? And I guess how it contributed to the East-West divide. So what is the Council of Trullo, or as it's also referred to, the Quinisext Council? So the word Quinisext means fifth, sixth in Greek. It might be Latin, actually. I think it's Greek. It might be similar in Latin as well. But the reason it's called that, and the reason it's not listed as a separate ecumenical council in Orthodoxy is, or just in the first millennium church, is because it was considered a continuation of the fifth and sixth ecumenical councils rather than a new standalone council. Here's why. Unlike the earlier councils, which dealt with theological dogma, Trullo mainly issued canons on discipline, liturgical practice, and clerical conduct. It did not define new doctrines, so it was not recognized as an independent ecumenical council, but rather as a supplement to the previous two ecumenical councils. It was meant to provide the disciplinary canons that the fifth and sixth ecumenical councils did not issue. So Trullo is ecumenical, authoritative, and binding, but it is considered part of the fifth and sixth ecumenical councils, not a separate ecumenical council on its own. And that's kind of why it really isn't talked about separately, but usually together with the previous two councils. The other reason why it's sometimes not mentioned as ecumenical is because there was an initial, and to this day, partial rejection of some of the canons of this council by Rome, particularly those emphasizing Eastern practices such as clerical marriage, fasting rules, and liturgical customs. And we'll all talk about these in a bit. But the reality is the Council of Trullo was actually accepted by the Western Church as part of the Fifth and Sixth Ecumenical Council, and its canons carry the same weight and authority as those from the other ecumenical councils in both the East and the West. The reason why the West today rejects some of its canons is because they directly oppose practices in the Roman Catholic Church, even though it was actually accepted by the West as ecumenical. And there's a great paper by Nicole Dura on the ecumenicity of the Council of Trullo. There's a copy of it on Ubi Petrus's blog. I don't think it's eligible on your PC, so if you are interested in viewing that, you'd have to view it on your phone. I have a link up there. I'll actually drop the link in the chat to this. So if you're on your phone, you can go ahead and view that. So that's a link to that article there. And she sort of revisits the council and how it was actually accepted by the West, and its canons carried the same weight, and it was accepted as ecumenical. So that's the Quinisext Council. And we'll go into the historical background of the council in a little bit, but why is this council important to Orthodox Christians? Because that's essentially, I think, is the big question, right? Well, because it basically codified essential canons that shape Orthodox liturgical and disciplinary practices. It also reaffirmed and standardized things like clerical marriage, fasting rules, icon veneration, and liturgical customs, distinguishing them from Western practices. So we start to see this more visible divide between East and West, and we'll get into all of those. But the council also reinforced Constantinople's authority in the church hierarchy and upheld the Eastern Church's canonical traditions against Roman innovations at that time. Many of the canons in Trullo do remain foundational in Orthodox Church law today. And there's a nice image there of Emperor Justinian II, who convened the council. As you can see there, Justinian has a disfigured face and a golden nose. The reason for that is 3 years after the Quinisext Council in 695, Justinian was overthrown in a coup led by a general named Leontios. As was common for deposed emperors during that time in Byzantium, Justinian's nose was cut off to prevent him from reclaiming the throne. That's why he was nicknamed the Slit-Nosed. He was then exiled to Crimea. However, he ends up escaping and allying with the Bulgars, and in 705, he marches back to Constantinople and he retook the throne. To hide his disfigured face, he had a golden prosthetic nose made. Now his second rule was very violent and brutal. He was kind of mad that he was deposed. So in his second rule, he executed a lot of people. He eventually was overthrown again 6 years later in 711 and was executed. Kind of the harsh nature of Byzantine politics. He's known as one of Byzantium's most infamous emperors. But interesting story there on Emperor Justinian. So the Council of Trullo, as I mentioned, was convened by Emperor Justinian II in 692 AD in Constantinople. It was held in the Imperial Palace. There's a nice computer reconstructed image there of the ancient palace. Not much is left of it today, only just some ruins remain. The name Trullo comes from the hall in the Imperial Palace. The hall was called the Trullo, meaning dome in Greek, because it had a very sort of distinctive domed ceiling. The reason this council was convened was because the fifth and sixth ecumenical councils had not issued any disciplinary canons, as I mentioned, which left many important matters of church governance, liturgical practices, and clerical discipline unresolved. So it was summoned to codify church laws and address innovations by Rome, which ultimately contributed to that, excuse me, growing divide between the Eastern and Western churches. Many of the council's canons were pretty much reiterations of the previous synods and the apostolic canons. The councils also confirmed the authority of the church fathers by reiterating many canons from church fathers like St. Basil, St. Gregory of Nazianzus, St. Cyril, St. Gregory of Nyssa, etc. It reiterated a lot of their canons. So ultimately, the aim of the council was to regulate church discipline, fasting, clerical marriage, and liturgy, as well as correct inconsistencies and address innovations introduced by the Church of Rome. So, reading through the canons, you also see that certain festivals and practices that had pagan origins are banned from being observed by Christians. Now, there are 102 canons in this council. We're not going to go through all the canons. We're just going to touch on a few of them, highlight a few major ones that sort of contributed to that East-West divide and sort of shape Christianity when it comes to the East and the Western churches as a whole. The other thing you'll see in the council explicitly condemning customs of Armenian Christians, or I think they call themselves apostolic Christians or the apostolic church. Things like them using unmixed wine unmixed with water for the Eucharist, choosing children for clergy, for appointment as clergy, eating eggs and cheese on Saturdays and Sundays of Lent, and things like that. But the canons that we're going to touch on are going to be more so the ones that pertain to the differences between the East and West. So the Castle of Trullo, oh, excuse me here. So the two canons I wanted to highlight that specifically relate to liturgical practices are Canon 11 and Canon 52. So Canon 11 speaks about the use of unleavened bread. Let's go ahead and read that canon there. It's a pretty short canon. Let no one in the priestly order nor any layman eat the unleavened bread of the Jews, nor have any familiar intercourse with them, nor summon them in illness, nor receive medicine from them, nor bathe with them. But if anyone shall take in hand to do so, if he is a cleric, let him be deposed. But if a layman, let him be cut off. So as we just read, Canon 11 is not about the Eucharistic use of unleavened bread, but rather about avoiding any association with the Jewish practice of using unleavened bread. It's prohibiting the consumption of unleavened bread in the context of Jewish practices, specifically during Passover. Condemning any priest or layperson who would eat unleavened bread of the Jews or have any familiarity with Jewish rituals, and any cleric doing so, the canon says, should be deposed and the layperson should be cut off from the church. The concern in this canon is not the Eucharist per se, but rather separating Christian practice from Jewish ones. But the reason I bring this up is because it still indirectly supports the use of leavened bread for the Eucharist. And one of the reasons we still use leavened bread in the Eucharist today is to distinguish our practices from the Jewish customs of leavened bread. And at this time, Rome was using leavened bread. The use of unleavened bread in the Eucharist in the Roman Church develops later, uh, in the ninth century, around the ninth century. So I'm sort of highlighting this to show you how Rome blatantly began to develop and add its own liturgical practices that were not observed by the early church. And the other thing before we move on to Canon 52 there is sometimes you'll see opponents of orthodoxy cite this canon to try and point out the early church being anti-Semitic. I think this may have been the canon that Redeemed Zoomer brought up in his debate against Luigi. But this is really stupid to say because one, it's talking about religious Jews, not ethnic Jews here. And two, the purpose of this canon is to keep Christians from becoming involved in Jewish religious observances and not restricting sort of basic human interactions outside the ritual context. Because at this time, if you were going to a Jewish doctor, they would perform like these weird religious Jewish rituals / witchcraft and feed you religious ritualistic medicine. Pretty obvious you should not be participating in that. So you can go to your Jewish family doctor. That's not what it's talking about. Unless he's, doing weird ritualistic healings, of course, then you should probably find a real doctor. So as Orthodox Christians, we should avoid participating in Jewish feasts or religious rituals. But the canon isn't indicating how we should interact socially or professionally with Jewish people in everyday life. But the other thing before we continue to Canon 52, don't try to read canons and apply them yourself. I think this is a dangerous game. If you have questions about something, talk to your priest. I'm not a priest. I'm just giving you historical context and my take on these canons, but you should always consult your priest. Now, moving on to Canon 52. It's a short one. It says, on all days of the holy fast of Lent, except on the Sabbath, the Lord's Day, and the holy day of the Annunciation, the liturgy of the pre-sanctified is to be said. So, Canon 52 is about how the Eucharist is celebrated during Lent in the Eastern Orthodox Church. During Lent, the Orthodox Church doesn't have the regular divine liturgy on weekdays. Instead, we celebrate a special service called the Liturgy of the Pre-Sanctified Gifts. And in this service, the Eucharist is distributed, but the bread and wine were already consecrated or blessed during the Sunday liturgy earlier in the week. So no new Eucharist is consecrated during weekdays. The idea is to focus on fasting and penance during the week and receive communion from the pre-sanctified gifts. It shows that the church is still offering the body and blood of Christ, even while observing a time of fasting. The only exception is that it doesn't happen on Saturday, Sundays, or the Feast of the Annunciation, which are still regular days for the Divine Liturgy, with the new Eucharist consecrated for those days. Now, in Rome at this time, Lent was already being observed differently. During Lent, the Roman Church held a daily Mass, and the Eucharist was consecrated every day. There's no special liturgy of the pre-sanctified gifts. So they were still encouraged to fast and pray during Lent, but they could receive the Eucharist a daily Mass, unlike in the East, where the Eucharist was only distributed from pre-sanctified gifts on weekdays. So they didn't separate the Eucharist from the daily Mass, and to this day, this is how Roman Catholics observe Lent. Now, this practice of consecrating the Eucharist every day during Lent was a deviation by the Roman Church from the ancient apostolic tradition, as outlined in Canon 52 here. The East, on the other hand, maintained the tradition of the liturgy of the pre-sanctified gifts during Lent, which was in accordance with the ancient practice of fasting and only distributing pre-consecrated Eucharist on weekdays. Rome, on the other hand, introduced an innovation, and I'll talk a lot more about these. You're going to hear this word a lot. Innovation. Rome keeps introducing innovations, and this is like, this is about over 300 plus years before the official Great Schism, but they've been introducing innovations ever since. That sort of split and divide started very early. So they introduced an innovation by consecrating the Eucharist daily during Lent, diverging from the ancient liturgical practice that was still practiced in the Eastern Church. So these growing differences between the East and West would eventually contribute to the larger divide between the two, and as we know, leads to the Great Schism in 1054. Around 1054, it's not like it hit 1054 and it was just like bam, schism. The East, on the other hand, preserved the ancient apostolic tradition, while Rome did not, as they began to develop their own distinct liturgical practices at this time. And this is the 7th century, right? The Council of Trullo is 692, so this is very early on. Okay, now this is a big one. Clerical marriage is a big one. Outlined in Canon 13. Let's go ahead and read the clerical marriage canon here. It's a bit of a longer one. Since we know it to be handed down as a rule of the Roman Church that those who are deemed worthy to be advanced to the diaconate or presbyterate should promise to no longer to cohabit with their wives, we preserving the ancient rule of the apostolic perfection and order, with that the lawful marriages of men who are in holy orders be from this time forward firm, by no means dissolving their union with their wives, nor depriving them of their mutual intercourse at a convenient time. Wherefore, if anyone shall have been found worthy to be ordained subdeacon or deacon or presbyter, he is by no means to be prohibited from admittance to such a rank, even if he shall live with a lawful wife. Nor shall it be damned of him at the time of his ordination that he promised to abstain from lawful intercourse with his wife, lest we should affect injuriously marriage constituted by God and blessed by his presence, as the gospel says, what God has joined together, let no man put asunder. And the apostles say, marriage is honorable and the bed undefiled. And again, are you bound to a wife? Seek not to be loosed. But we know, as they who assembled at Carthage, which care with a care for the honest life of the clergy, said that subdeacons who handle the holy mysteries and deacons and presbyters should abstain from their consort according to their own course of ministration. So that what has been handed down through the apostles and preserved by ancient custom, we too likewise maintain, knowing that there is a time for all things, and especially for fasting and prayer. For it is meet that they who assist at the divine altar should be absolutely continent when they are handling holy things, in order that they may be able to obtain from God what they ask in sincerity. If therefore anyone shall have dared, contrary to the apostolic canons, see, they're just affirming the apostolic canons here, to deprive any of those who are in holy orders, presbyter or deacon or subdeacon, of cohabitation and intercourse with his lawful wife, let him be deposed. In like manner also, if any presbyter or deacon or pretense of piety has dismissed his wife, let him be excluded from communion. And if he persevere in this, let him be deposed. This canon explicitly defends the right of clergy to remain with their wives after ordination. And this is something that was not being done in Rome. It recognizes marriage as God-given and honorable. However, it also acknowledges the clergy should practice a temporary abstinence from marital relations during times of fasting and when serving at the altar. This sort of balanced approach here in this canon maintains both the sanctity of marriage and the spiritual focus required for liturgical service. It also makes for much better pastors, in my opinion, among clergy. because no matter how knowledgeable you are in the area of marriage, it still doesn't compare to actual direct experience, I think. So if you're a priest at a parish doing marriage and couples counseling, you'll be able to provide much better and relatable insight to the couples if you are married and have a family yourself. That's not knocking the unmarried priest, but I mean, it's just true. So the Orthodox Church preserved the ancient and apostolic practice of allowing married men to be ordained as priests and deacons, while Rome, as we can see, departed from this. While the Roman Church wasn't universally at this time requiring celibacy from their priests yet in the 7th century, it gradually imposed mandatory celibacy on its clergy. And as we know today, this culminated in a total ban on married priests in the 11th century, particularly under Pope Gregory VII during the Gregorian reforms. Then at the Council of Piacenza in 1095, Pope Urban II condemns married clergy. Then during the First Lateran Council in 1123, married clergy are declared invalid, making celibacy an absolute requirement in the West for clergy. Then at the Second Council in Lateran in 1139, it's officially decreed that marriage of priests were not just prohibited, but also invalid from the very start. This went far, way far and beyond the apostolic tradition, and even contradicted earlier Western church practices, where married priests were once common. I mean, clear and blatant innovations and accretions by Rome. So Canon 13 directly condemns any attempt to forcibly separate clergy from their lawful wives. Yet Rome not only imposed celibacy, but also later required priests who were already married to abandon their wives if they wish to continue serving. As you can see, the Orthodox Church upheld the traditions of the apostles and early fathers in this manner. Rome, on the other hand, introduced new rules that departed from the original practice of the church. This is the 7th century, and we're already seeing early signs of this. Now, Canon 36 here touches on ecclesiastical hierarchy. Let's go ahead and read the canon. It's a pretty short one. Renewing the enactments by the 150 fathers assembled at the God-protected and imperial city, and those of the 630 who met at Chalcedon, we decree that the see of Constantinople shall have equal privileges with the see of Old Rome, and shall be highly regarded in ecclesiastical matters as that is, and shall be second after it, after Constantinople, shall be ranked the see of Alexandria, then that of Antioch, and afterwards the see of Jerusalem. So like all the other canons in Trullo, nothing new is being said in this canon. It's simply reaffirming what previous ecumenical councils have already established. Here it's just reiterating the decisions of the First Council of Constantinople in 381 and the Council of Chalcedon in 451 that granted Constantinople equal privileges to Rome in ecclesiastical matters. It established the hierarchical order of the patriarchates, with Rome still holding primacy, by the way. Rome was still granted primacy, followed by Constantinople, then Alexandria, then Antioch, and then Jerusalem. There is an argument being made today that Moscow should hold primacy, as people have many issues with the ecumenical patriarch and the see in Constantinople. I'm not going to get into it, but in the context of the established traditions, this claim, I mean, just absolutely lacks both historical and theological justification. So anyways, so Rome later ends up rejecting this canon because it was a direct contradiction of the doctrine of papal supremacy, which Rome later claiming that the Pope of Rome has absolute jurisdiction over all the other bishops. So this is one of the clear early examples of the power trip that Rome is later to go on. and later schism from all the other bishops. And as more time passes, Rome further loses their mind, and the Council of Florence and Vatican I further solidified the doctrine of papal supremacy, rejecting any notion of equal privileges among the patriarchates. And as we know, to this day, the Roman Catholic Church does not recognize the canonical authority of this ruling, maintaining instead that the Pope has supreme authority over the entire church. So the Orthodox Church upheld the principle of conciliarity, or shared authority among patriarchates, while Rome moved towards the centralized model under the Pope, completely diverging from the ancient apostolic and conciliar governance of the early church. So who really are the schismatics here? I'm going to let you decide that. Canon 55 and 56. These canons touch on the differences in fasting rules between the East and West, and they affirm the ecclesiastical observance that is traditional. So let's go ahead and read Canon 55 here. Since we understand that in the city of the Romans, in the holy fast of Lent, they fast on the Saturdays, contrary to the ecclesiastical observance, which is traditional. It seemed good to the Holy Synod that also in the Church of the Romans that the canon shall immovably stands fast, which says, if any cleric shall be found to fast on Sunday or Saturday, except on one occasion only, he is to be deposed. And if he is a layman, he shall be cut off. So no fasting on Saturdays and Sundays during Lent, except certain cases. So clergy or laity, says, who fast on these days are to be deposed or excommunicated. So Rome historically, and during this time, did not forbid fasting on Saturdays or Sundays during Lent, and in fact fasted on these days. So this is a clear departure from traditional and ecclesiastical observance, as we see happens later. Canon 56. We have likewise learned that in the regions of Armenia and in the other places, certain people eat eggs and cheese on the Sabbaths and Lord's Day of the Holy Lent. It seems good, therefore, that the whole church of God, which is in all the world, should follow the rule and keep the fast perfectly. And as they abstain from everything which is killed, so also should they from eggs and cheese, which are the fruit of produce of those animals which we abstain. But if any shall not observe this law, if they be clerics, let them be deposed. But if laymen, let them be cut off. According to church tradition, a strict fast during Lent includes abstaining from eggs and cheese, which are considered products of animals from which meat is abstained. And those who violate this are subject to excommunication, it says, or deposition, whether they are clergy or laity. Roman Catholics during Lent today eat dairy products like eggs and cheese. This is in direct opposition to church tradition as outlined here in Canon 56. But notice that Canon 56 doesn't mention the Roman Church eating dairy products during Lent, but the Christians of Armenia. That's because during this time in the 7th century, Western Christians were following stricter fasting disciplines that align with how we fast today in Orthodoxy. That's why the canon does not condemn the Romans for this, implying that the Roman Church was still abstaining from dairy during Lent. Historically, the Latin Church actually observed what was called a black fast, which included strict abstinence from animal products, including dairy during Lent, similar to what we have in the East. It was only centuries later that the Western churches relaxed its fasting rules, eventually allowing dairy products. Both Canon 55 and 56 show clear innovations in the West. In the current Western practice of fasting during Lent, as the West at this time held to the church traditions of a strict fast during Lent, and they do not anymore. as you can see, there is constant changes throughout the history of the Western Church. Innovations. Okay. And the last canon that I wanted to touch on is Canon 82, which addresses things concerning to iconography. So let's go ahead and read that. In some pictures of the venerable icons, a lamb is painted to which the precursor points his finger, which is received as a type of grace, indicating beforehand through the law our true lamb, Christ our God, embracing therefore the ancient types and shadows as symbols of the truth and patterns given to the church. We prefer grace and truth, receiving it as the fulfillment of the law. In order, therefore, that which is perfect may be delineated to the eyes of all as least in colored expression. We decree that the figure in human form of the Lamb who takes away the sin of the world, Christ our God, be henceforth exhibited in images instead of the ancient Lamb, so that all may understand by means of it the depth of the humiliation of the Word of God, and that we may recall to our memory his conversation in the flesh, his passion and solitary death, and his redemption, which was wrought for the whole world. So this is an interesting canon because it explicitly prohibited the use of symbolic presentations or representations, such as the lamb being represented as Christ, and instead mandated that Christ be depicted in human form. I bet many of you didn't know that. And this is an interesting one because I see this in a lot of people's profile pictures. I'm not sure if they're Orthodox or not, but I do see this symbolism presented quite a bit. The reason for this prohibition was theological. Symbols like the lamb were used in earlier Christian art as prefigurations. The incarnation, however, made it clear that Christ should be portrayed in his full humanity, emphasizing his real historical existence, suffering, and redemption, which the symbolic lamb did not represent theologically. And these canons were eventually accepted in Rome, but they still continued to use symbolic imagery, including depictions of Christ as a lamb. And as more time passed, Western Christian iconography became even more symbolic and allegorical, while the East stayed true to Canon 82, to Trullo, to the Quinisext Council. So the divergence here by Rome, I think, reflects a much broader difference in theology and worship, with the East emphasizing realism and incarnation in iconography, while the West retained these sort of abstract and symbolic elements, which later developed into the more naturalistic and sort of Renaissance style art in the West. I believe the West's use of symbolic representation undermined the reality of the incarnation. Those are my thoughts. The East, though, continue to uphold the apostolic and patristic understanding that icons are not just symbolic, but theological expressions of Christ's real historical presence. By ignoring this canon, the West failed to embrace the theological implications of the incarnation, leading to a departure from the apostolic tradition. All right. So, what was Rome's response to this council? Well, as I mentioned earlier, Rome initially rejected the Council of Trullo. Pope Sergius first rejected its canons, particularly those that contradicted Western practices, as I mentioned, a few of them, and we just read some of them. And many later popes also refused to even recognize the council, viewing it as an illegitimate extension of the fifth and sixth ecumenical councils. But as that link I dropped in there, Nicole Dura, in her work that I mentioned earlier in the stream, points to Rome acknowledging the council as ecumenical and its canons being accepted, especially under Pope Constantine. He accepts this council as authoritative, ecumenical, and he accepts all the canons of this council. But then we see that later popes see that these canons are explicitly contradictory to the innovations of Rome, explicitly reject key canons, right? Particularly those concerning things like clerical marriage, liturgical practices, and especially papal supremacy. So they just kind of cherry pick the canons they want to accept and which they want to reject. Because the Pope can do whatever he wants, right? He would go against ecumenical councils, apparently. And by the time of the Great Schism in 1054, and especially under Gregory the Seventh reforms, Trullo's canons were pretty much fully rejected by the Roman Church. So looking at it historically, we see the Rome stance shifts over time. They continue to innovate and move further and further away from the historic faith of the apostles and fathers. So first we see Pope Sergius reject this council because many of the canons were contradictory to the teachings of the West. And then we see sometime later passes, it's fully accepted, especially during Pope Constantine, as authoritative. The canons are accepted. The council is ecumenical. And then later popes come through and things begin to change in Rome. They begin to move further and further away. They begin to innovate. And this council becomes completely contradictory to Rome, to their teachings, right? Their liturgical, clerical practices, and especially papal supremacy. And they just outright reject this council. I mean, you tell me. I mean, that is silly. So I think it's evident by now that there is quite a big lasting impact from this council today. Orthodox Christians, Christianity as a whole, Western Christians, Christians of all kind. The canons of Trullo to this day continue to shape Eastern Orthodox canon law and ecclesiastical discipline. As you can see, when we have debates today, right, people bring up the Council of Trullo because it shapes Orthodox canon law and ecclesiastical discipline today, as all the other ecumenical councils do. It shapes rules on clerical marriage, fasting regulations, and iconography. And these things are fundamental to our Orthodox life. Right, then we have the liturgy of the pre-sanctified gifts during Lent, the prohibition of kneeling on Sundays, and the requirement for bishops to be celibate, all stem from these canons, are still observed in Orthodox tradition today. We see how Trullo solidified key differences between Eastern and Western Christianity and further perpetuate the divide that would later lead to the Great Schism of 1054. And this is very early on. This is the year 692. This is the 7th century, and we already see this divide. Right? The use of leavened versus unleavened bread, the approach to clerical celibacy, fasting rules, and even how Christ was depicted are all became points of contention between the East and the West. Trullo also reinforced the authority of Constantinople as second only to Rome. And this is in direct opposition, challenging papal supremacy. I mean, this is a major theological and political divide today. So this council and its canons, its 102 canons, have a massive impact and a lasting impact on Christianity today as it pertains to the East and the West. And this is like 1,500 years later. The Council of Trullo, I think, historically speaking, looking at church history, marked a huge breaking point moment in church history. Earlier councils dealt primarily with Christological heresies. This council dealt with a lot of practical things. So Trullo just really exposed the deep difference in governance, liturgical practice, and canonical tradition between East and West. Although communion between these two churches persisted for centuries after Trullo, for about another 300 years, we see that this council did foreshadow the growing rift that would culminate in the Great Schism of 1054. So a very important council. And like I said, this council isn't talked about a lot, Trullo or the Quinisext Council. And the reason being is because it's a continuation. These are codified canons from the previous two councils, the fifth and the sixth. So usually they're kind of talked about together, but you never hear it mentioned. Even when I went to see if there was any content out there on like YouTube about the Council of Trullo or the Quinisext Council, there's really not a lot. Like you find videos from like 12 years old of like AI generated voices 12 years ago, like just giving you like Wikipedia basics about the Council of Trullo. But it was a massive and sort of this early point of contention and split and divide between the East and the West, to where Rome or the West began to introduce a lot of innovations and began to move farther and farther away from the apostolic faith. So in conclusion, the Council of Trullo stood very, very firm in preserving the ancient practices of the church. Rome's initial rejection of the council, particularly under Pope Sergius, as we mentioned, was due to the fact that the canons directly contradicted Roman innovations. Though Rome later accepted the council's canons, they eventually rejected them again, exposing their ongoing departure from the apostolic traditions and the teachings of the church fathers. I mean, if more Roman Catholics were to just read church history, I think it would really open their eyes. This sort of back and forth highlights the growing divergence between the East and West, and the innovations that led to Rome's separation from the faith and practices of the early church. All right, before we close, this is a fairly short stream, I think, about an hour long. Usually I go a little bit longer. But I think I presented a compelling case that the Council of Trullo upheld the ancient traditions of the church by firmly rejecting foreign innovations introduced by Rome. Trullo preserved the teachings and practices handed down to us from the apostles and the church fathers. The commitment of the Eastern Church to the apostolic faith showed the ongoing divergence between East and West, with Trullo standing as a clear testament to the Orthodox Church's refusal to compromise on the traditions and the faith of the apostles and the church fathers. And the church stands firm in this today. That's why we're a church that is constantly rejecting innovations. We're a church that stands firm in the faith. We go against, right, ecumenism, these worldly ecumenistic things that try to seep into the church. We stand firm on the traditions of the apostles and the fathers and the church, maintaining this unwavering commitment to preserving the true teachings passed down through the centuries without innovations that Rome introduces. This council was a firm declaration that the Orthodox Church will not accept innovations that deviate from the apostolic foundation, ensuring that the faith remains true, that it remains pure, that it remains unaltered. While Rome, on the other hand, repeatedly deviated from the apostolic traditions and the teachings of the church fathers. And I think it's evident when you look at the Council of Trullo. I don't believe there's anything within the canons that affirms the canon of Scripture. So, but anyways, that's all for today, guys. Thank you for joining me for this sort of short, about hour-long stream. I want to do more things pertaining to church history, just to get you guys familiar with at least like the first 1,000, the first millennium church, and sort of these major decisions, these major councils. So, because knowing church history is essentially what makes you an Orthodox Christian. So even just being like fairly familiar with these ecumenical councils, the decisions that were made there, you're going to understand Orthodoxy much better, and you're going to understand how these councils influence Orthodoxy today, right? These ecumenical councils are infallible. So I want to go through some of these big decisions. I don't know necessarily if I want to go through, like the big ecumenical council. I might touch on some of them because I think a lot of people are familiar with at least the 7 ecumenical councils. But just go through some of these synods and some of these councils and some of these historical decisions that aren't really talked about much, that have a massive impact on Orthodoxy today. So that's all for today, guys. Thank you for joining me. I'll see you guys next week. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, like, share, comment, and subscribe for more, and follow my social medias in the description below. I'll see you next time. God bless.